All right, picking up from the last video, let's make some comparisons with actual data. The long-term unemployment rate in the European Union countries is 8 to 11%. Contrast that from the Anglo model, the US, of 5 to 7%. You probably have a good sense of why now. From the last video, we learned that the rigidity of labor and for an employer, that inability to terminate expeditiously if you get a bad employee, the requirement that you provide workers with co-determination and democracy and have them as a decision maker within the business. All of that makes labor a little bit more risky for the firm, and so they're less likely to employ labor, which means unemployment rates tend to be higher. The big factor here, though, quite frankly, is the higher benefits that come from being unemployed. In the U.S., someone that receives unemployment compensation will get a check for a period of time. But it's not a big check. It's not a large fraction of their pre-unemployment wage. Whereas in these European countries, workers may get a larger percentage of their pre-unemployment wage. That alone provides a strong incentive to stay unemployed. So it's not just that it's hard for firms to employ labor. It's also that workers have an incentive to stay unemployed. 2005 to 2010, we have 40% of the EU labor force was part-time, only 17% in the US. Again, fitting with that two-tiered labor market where you have part-time workers coexisting with full-time workers. Companies don't want to employ full-time workers because it's harder to terminate, and something we haven't talked about, there's a lot more benefits that must be provided to full-time workers and part-time workers. From 2005 to 2011, the average unemployment duration was 10 months, but it was only 4 months in the US. So people are staying unemployed longer. Again, in part because of rigidity of labor, but also of the higher benefits that come from unemployment, more of an incentive to stay unemployed longer. And then strong resistance to change, measured by days lost to a strike. A strike is when a unionized labor force walks out on the job. Okay, and that is their weapon that they use to get better negotiation and better benefits. From 1994 to 99, Spain actually lost 250 days per year per 1,000 workers. Italy lost 100 days. France 90 days, whereas in the US it was only 10 days. So you're seeing more collective bargaining among European workers because they are striking, right? But on top of that, you're also seeing a willingness to challenge the firm to get those rights. And that's an example of labor empowerment, something that is not as common in the US. In fact, one thing we learned is that the unions in the U.S. are actually uncommon, less than 12% of the labor force, whereas in some of these European countries, it could be upwards of 75, 80% of the labor force are unionized. Take a look at this data here. This is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development Index of Employment Protection. The higher the index, the more the protection. So notice that our Anglo countries here tend to have a lower index compared to our European countries. The Asian countries we'll get to later, not as high as in Europe, but not as low as in the Anglo countries. Taxes and regulations. The European system has higher taxes and more regulation. Again, it fits with that larger role for government. There's what we call non-tax compulsory payments. These are employer payments for things like pension, unemployment insurance, and health benefits. So in the US, a non-tax compulsory payment would be when an employer is required to pay, for example, for Social Security or pay for Medicare. So that when that person retires, they get those benefits. Well, those types of benefits are not only greater in the European Union, but they're broader. There's a lot more benefits that the employer must pay for on behalf of the employee. And that creates what's called a tax wedge. This is a difference between the wage the worker actually gets and what the employer pays. The employer in every country is always paying more than what the employee sees. So let's just make up some numbers. Let's say the employer pays $25 an hour for workers, but the employee ends up seeing on their paycheck $15 an hour. Well, that would be a tax wedge of $10. From the standpoint of the worker and the employer, they want the minimum tax wedge, right? I mean, the ultimate for both parties would be what the worker pays, the employee gets. I'm sorry, what the employer pays, the worker gets. But that's not the case anywhere, because there is this tax wedge. And the higher the wedge, the greater likelihood workers and employers will move to more competitive nations. So if you have a country like, say, Germany, that has a tax wedge of the equivalent of $10 an hour, but let's say Switzerland only has a tax wedge of $6 an hour, well, employees and employers would want to locate to Switzerland because there would be less of that leakage to the government. The employers would pay what the employees get. Unionization, declining across Europe and in the US, but still much higher, as I mentioned previously. And again, unionization requires a collectivist attitude, spawns in countries where there's that willingness to come together for a united purpose. And it's less likely to spawn in a country like the US, where workers are more individual oriented. They want to negotiate with the employer based on their own experience, their own education, their own unique resume. Whereas in Europe, there's less of that desire to negotiate individually. They want to get together with other workers to find that optimal collective bargaining outcome. Public employment. Bigger government means more public employment. And so it's higher in Europe than in the US. And it's growing over time in both countries, but definitely more so in Europe. Finally, let's talk about the European welfare state. This is the big one and really distinguishes the Anglo model from the European model. The European welfare state is another way of describing all the safety net programs, from straight out cash subsidies to households, all the way to government provision of healthcare or government provision of education, college education, things like that. So it's a large cornucopia of pecuniary and non-pecuniary benefits that could flow to people. But that also means that the government is going to have to charge more in taxes. Large welfare states are expensive, and that means that taxes are typically higher. In these countries that have large welfare states, the elderly population often relies on the government for their provisions than on their own savings or on their own retirement pension accounts. In some countries, this is so significant that people may not really save, and people may not worry about getting a benefit from their employers. Things like 401ks or individual retirement accounts, or those types of things that are common in the US, may be much less common in the European model because the government is effectively saving for them. The potential long-term issues with this, well, increased spending as demographics shift towards older and more dependent populace. The welfare state will always gravitate towards older people because they're the ones that are going to be the more vulnerable. They're the ones that are less likely to be marketable in the workplace for a variety of reasons, and they're the ones that are also going to have the most medical needs. They're the ones that are going to have the needs for basic necessities and so forth. So welfare states, you can think of a lot of people benefiting from it, but senior citizens are the biggest fraction. And as you get a demographic shift away from young people towards older people, which a lot of countries have seen as the industrialized world has experienced a baby bust, right? People are having less kids. And so that results in older generations being a larger percentage of the population pie. That shift has made these welfare states much more expensive. And it's caused, in some cases, very high taxes, but in other cases, it's also caused a lot of debt for countries. Either way, it creates a burden financially on the state that otherwise wouldn't be there. Higher taxes often decrease economic performance and could lower government revenue. We say, well, if we're going to provide more benefits to people and they're willing to pay the higher taxes, well, that's a good thing, right? I mean, what's wrong with that? Why not pay higher taxes to have the government provide you a lot of benefits? There is a downside, though, because it's not as simple as just paying higher taxes for government provisions. The higher taxes often decrease the incentive to go into business, decrease the incentive to get an education, to take risks, and to save. I mean, you remember, taxes hit income, and so any activity that generates income is going to now have this disincentive because you're going to keep a smaller fraction of that income generated. And the decreased education, the decreased technological advancement, the decreased business activity can lower the productivity of the country and actually decrease government revenue. Because the government revenue is based on the taxes, but also on what's called the tax base, which is all that income that is taxed in the country. Well, if the lower productivity is decreasing the tax base, then even with high taxes, you may not have a whole lot of revenue coming in. And it's not uncommon for these countries to experience this problem, leading them to take on debt rather than rely solely on taxes. Countries in the Scandinavian region of the world, these like Finland and Denmark, Sweden, these countries have managed to keep taxes high and at the same time fund the large welfare state without a lot of debt. But countries in Southern Europe, like in Italy and most notably in Greece, have brought about economic debt that has become unsustainable and has brought about pretty severe consequences in other areas. Let's talk about the Swedish model. In the 1960s and the 70s, the Swedes expanded their transfer programs to exceptional levels, even by European standards. And what they were trying to accomplish was universal coverage. That is, to make sure that anybody and everybody could qualify for benefits, regardless of whether they worked or not. This lowered the Gini coefficient from 0.28 to 0.2. Now, you'll recall that a lower Gini coefficient corresponds to less inequality. That's a significant drop. It didn't come without a cost, though. In 1971, the tax reform lowered the marginal take-home pay to 30% for individuals and 10 to 15% for executives. Now, the take-home pay is how much you get to keep of every dollar you earn. So just think about that. It lowered the return. For every dollar you earned, you got to keep 30%, 30 cents. And if you were an executive, you got to keep 10 to 15%, 10 to 15 cents per dollar. Strong disincentive for productivity. And a lot of people, would be inclined to leave a country like that if they are a high income earner. The taxes represented 52% of GDP in Sweden. For the US contrast, it was 17%, the UK 40%, and France 51%, Germany 44%. So this was high even by European standards. Private pension funds became almost non-existent. Why have private pension funds when the government is effectively providing everybody this safety net? In other words, you don't need to save for your own retirement through your job or through your own funds. You just wait for government to do it for you and suffer the high taxes in the interim. This link here will take you to the Tax Foundation on Scandinavian countries. So check this out. You can get a little bit of perspective as to just how those taxes work. But the Swedish model is, to many, a success. I mean, Bernie Sanders is running on a platform that would probably want to bring the Swedish model to the US. But it's not all benefits. There's a cost too, and that means higher taxes. And one of the reasons that we actually see the lower Gini coefficient is not that you're equalizing incomes amongst the population. You may actually be losing the population that is higher income earning. In other words, you're running off the higher income people, and that's creating more equality. Well, why would you be running them off? Because if you're a high income earner, you're not going to be attracted to a country that has high taxes. On the other side, though, you can say that, look, there's probably a lot less homelessness in the Scandinavian countries. There's a lot less worry for necessities and that you're not going to be taken care of as you get older. That concern that you're going to be dependent on others may not be as pronounced in these countries as it would be in the U.S. or Anglo model, because you always have government providing you a basic standard of living. It's a mixed bag. Sweden has found that the costs of these programs has gotten very high over time, especially as those demographics shift towards older people, which means the Swedes have moved away from this model from its peak. It's still the most welfare state heavy model in Europe, but it's not as welfare heavy as it would have been, decades ago. All right, guys, that's it. If you have questions, please let me know.